The moment Florence Winslow nailed her hand-painted sign to the front door of the Dusty Creek Town Hall, she knew she had declared war on every man who believed women ought to stay quiet and grateful. It was the spring of 1878, and Dusty Creek, Texas, sat baking under a relentless sun that bleached the wagon ruts white and drove the jackrabbits deep into whatever shade they could find. The town was not large by any measure. There was a main street of packed earth flanked by a general store, a livery stable, a barber shop, a saloon called the Copper Spur, a small schoolhouse, and a church whose white paint was already beginning to peel from its southern face. Beyond the main street, modest homes spread outward like the spokes of a wheel, each with a kitchen garden in various stages of survival, and behind all of it lay the open grassland that stretched toward the distant line of hills, hazy and purple in the heat. Florence Winslow was 26 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died of fever 2 winters past, and a mother who had gone even earlier, taken by a difficult childbirth when Florence was only 9. She had been raised on books and stubbornness in roughly equal measure, and she wore both like armor. She was not what most of Dusty Creek considered a conventional beauty, though she was striking in the way a lightning bolt is striking, sharp and luminous and impossible to ignore. Her dark hair was almost always pinned up in a practical arrangement that still managed to come loose by midday, and her gray eyes held the particular quality of someone who was listening even when she appeared to be doing something else entirely. She had arrived in Dusty Creek 3 years prior, following her father's old teaching colleague, a man named Hector Price, who had promised her a teaching position at the schoolhouse. The position had materialized, and Florence had taken it gladly, teaching reading and arithmetic to the children of ranchers and shopkeepers with a dedication that was beyond dispute. What was disputed, and increasingly so, was everything else she did. The sign she nailed to the town hall door read, "Town water supply contaminated. Demand an answer." She had spent 6 weeks documenting it. 6 weeks of watching the creek that fed the town's well run a strange color after heavy rain. 6 weeks of noticing that the Beale children, who lived nearest the northern well, were perpetually sick with stomach ailments. 6 weeks of quietly testing the water herself using a method her father had once shown her from a chemistry pamphlet, and finding evidence of what she strongly suspected was runoff from the new tanning operation that had set up along the creek's upper bank 3 months ago. The tanning operation belonged to Gerald Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore also sat on the Dusty Creek Town Council. He was the kind of man who was wealthy enough that his opinions sounded like facts to the people around him, and he had a way of smiling that never quite reached his eyes. Florence had brought her findings to the council 2 weeks prior, at a regular monthly meeting held in the very hall whose door she was now decorating. She had presented her observations clearly. She had brought samples in sealed jars. She had asked politely, though with evident frustration, that the council investigate the water source before more children became ill. Gerald Whitmore had thanked her for her concern with the particular tone of a man handling a child's drawing appreciative, in a way that dismissed everything at once. The other 3 council members, Emmett Birch, who owned the bank, Jonas Fail, who owned the feed supply, and the council chairman, Arthur Dean, who seemed to own mostly the sound of his own voice, had nodded along with him. The matter had been tabled. Florence had been escorted, not roughly but with considerable finality, back to her seat. Now she was back, and she had brought a sign, and she had spent the previous evening telling every family she could reach about what she had found, and she intended to keep standing in front of that town hall until someone with authority decided that the health of Dusty Creek's children was worth more than Gerald Whitmore's comfort. By mid-morning, she had an audience of about a dozen people, mostly women, a few older men, 2 or 3 of the older schoolchildren who had followed her down the street out of curiosity. The women were the ones who truly understood. They were the ones who boiled the water and made the soup and sat up at night with sick children, and they had been noticing the same things Florence had noticed, only they had not had Florence's particular education or Florence's particular nerve. The town council convened an emergency session by noon. Arthur Dean came to the door of the hall with the expression of a man who had just discovered a cat sitting on his best hat. He looked at Florence at her sign at the small gathering around her, and he pulled himself up to his full and unimpressive height. "Miss Winslow," he said in the tone that men of his type reserved for situations they intended to resolve by sheer volume of self-assurance, "this is not how things are done in Dusty Creek. You have made your concerns known. The council has heard them. The council will address them in due time." "Children are sick now," Florence said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced being steady in the face of men like Arthur Dean, since she was old enough to understand what men like him were. Due time is not an appropriate answer when we are talking about contaminated drinking water. The water has not been proven contaminated. I have brought you samples. I have documentation. You are a school teacher, Miss Winslow, not a chemist. My father taught me enough chemistry to read the evidence clearly, Mr. Dean, and I would be happy to send those samples to the assay office in Fort Worth if you would prefer a professional opinion. Arthur Dean's face went the particular shade of red that occurs when a man realizes an argument he expected to win is slipping sideways. He cleared his throat. He looked at the gathered crowd. He looked back at Florence. "This council," he said, loudly enough for the crowd to hear, "is labeling this behavior as disruptive and contrary to the good order of this community. Miss Winslow, you are hereby formally identified as a troublemaker by the town council of Dusty Creek, and I am requesting that you remove that sign from public property immediately." There was a murmur from the crowd, not necessarily in Florence's favor. Some people in Dusty Creek were deeply afraid of being on the wrong side of men like Arthur Dean and Gerald Whitmore. Fear has a way of dressing itself up as reasonableness, and Florence had lived long enough to recognize the costume. She did not remove the sign. She stood there with her back straight and her hands folded in front of her, and she looked at Arthur Dean with the calm of a woman who has already decided what she is willing to lose, and said, "Then I will be a troublemaker." It was precisely at that moment that Levi Lockhart rode into Dusty Creek. He came from the north, which was unusual, since most travelers came up from the Fort Worth road. He came on a bay horse named Calico, which was a name that made very little sense for a bay horse, but which Levi had given her when she was a foal, and which she had apparently grown into despite its inaccuracy. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulder in the way of a man who had spent the better part of a decade doing physical work in open country, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that needed shaving, and the kind of weathered face that the Texas sun produced in men who spent a lot of time outdoors. He had been a working cattle hand for most of his adult life, ranging across central Texas and into the Panhandle, working for various outfits before the previous winter, when the cattle operation he had been foreman of had sold to an Eastern investor who had promptly fired everyone, reorganized everything, and run the whole enterprise into the ground within 4 months. Levi had been on the road since February, picking up short-term work where he could find it, sleeping under the open sky more often than not, and trying to figure out what he wanted to do with the second half of his life. He had no particular opinion about Dusty Creek. He had stopped there twice before in passing and found it unremarkable. He was stopping now because Calico had thrown a shoe 3 miles back and he needed a blacksmith. He rode down the main street at a slow walk, watching the small commotion in front of the town hall with the mild curiosity of a man who had seen plenty of frontier disagreements and was not immediately looking for involvement in another one. He noticed the woman standing at the center of it before he noticed anything else about the scene. It would have been difficult not to. She stood like she had roots going 20 feet into the ground, gray eyes steady, dark hair already beginning to escape its pins in the morning heat, and her expression was the expression of someone who was not going to be moved by anything short of an act of God or a very compelling argument. He filed that image away somewhere in the back of his mind and rode on toward the livery stable. The blacksmith, a quiet man named Cal Prout, took Calico in without a lot of fuss and said the shoe would be ready by late afternoon. Levi thanked him, paid a small deposit, and went to find some food. He ended up in the general store, buying dried beef and a tin of peaches, and the woman behind the counter, who introduced herself as Mabel Greer, supplied him with the entire history of the town's current situation in the time it took to count out his change. "That's Florence Winslow out there," Mabel said, nodding toward the direction of the town hall. "She's been fighting with the council for 2 weeks about the water. Our children have been getting sick, and she's the only one who's done a single thing about it, and they've gone and called her a troublemaker, which, if you ask me, is about the most upside-down thing I have heard since my husband tried to tell me that rain comes from the ground going up." "What's wrong with the water?" Levi asked. Mabel told him about the tanning operation and Gerald Whitmore and the samples and the council meeting and all of it. She was a thorough woman with a gift for narrative, and by the time she finished, Levi had a very clear picture of the situation and had eaten most of his dried beef without noticing. He stepped back outside into the bright Texas morning and looked down the street toward the town hall, where Florence Winslow was still standing in front of the door, still not having removed her sign, while Arthur Dean appeared to be telling her something that was not improving anyone's day. Levi Lockhart was not, by nature, a man who involved himself in other people's disputes. He had learned early in life that frontier towns had their own complicated webs of loyalty and history, and that riding into the middle of them without knowing the full picture was a good way to create enemies you did not understand and problems you had not anticipated. He also had a deeply ingrained instinct for fairness that had gotten him into approximately as much trouble over the years as it had gotten him out of, and that instinct was currently speaking to him in a loud and persuasive voice. He walked down the main street toward the town hall. By the time he arrived, the council had apparently decided to hold their emergency session outdoors, in the interest of dealing with the problem in full public view, which had the effect of making everything more theatrical than it might otherwise have been. Arthur Dean was holding forth about the proper channels for civic concern. Gerald Whitmore was standing slightly behind him with the expression of a man who expected to be protected and usually was. Emmett Birch and Jonas Fail were flanking them both with the expressions of men who had made their choices and were committed to them. Florence was still standing at the door. A woman beside her, holding a baby on her hip, had a look of fierce solidarity. 2 others had joined them. The crowd had grown a little. Arthur Dean was in the middle of a long and elaborate declaration about the legal standing of the town council and its authority over public property when he paused for breath. And in that pause, Levi Lockhart raised his hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, hat in hand, a stranger without a horse at the moment, and the gesture was simply the gesture of a man who wished to be recognized, the way a student raises a hand in a classroom. It stopped the proceedings nonetheless, partly because strangers were still unusual enough in Dusty Creek to command attention, and partly because Levi had the kind of physical presence that rooms noticed even before he opened his mouth. "I beg your pardon," he said, when Arthur Dean fixed him with a look that was half suspicion and half annoyance. "I am just passing through, and I understand that makes me something of an outsider here. But I was a ranch foreman for 8 years, and on every spread I worked, clean water was the first priority over everything else. Cattle die without it. Crops fail without it. Children certainly suffer without it." He paused. "That woman there, Miss Winslow, I believe, has brought you documented evidence of a problem. She is right to bring it. And if your council has the power to label her a troublemaker for doing so, then I would suggest that the label is pointed in the wrong direction. There was a silence of the particular quality that occurs when something true has been said in a public place, and everyone present knows it is true, and nobody is quite sure what to do with the fact. Arthur Dean found his voice first. "And who might you be, sir?" "Levi Lockhart," he said. "Just a working man waiting on a blacksmith, but I know contaminated water when I hear it described, and I know right from wrong, and she is right." The silence expanded, and then one of the men in the crowd, a rancher named Tom Beauchamp, whose youngest daughter had been ill for 3 weeks with stomach troubles, said, "I am with her too." And then Mabel Greer, who had apparently followed Levi down the street, said, "Every mother in this town is with her." And the weight of public opinion, which is a fickle and sometimes cowardly thing, but which in this moment had been given a spine by one quiet cowboy and one stubborn schoolteacher, shifted. Gerald Whitmore's face had gone through several colors during this exchange. He settled finally on a pale and calculating expression. He was a businessman, and businessmen of his type understand when a position has become untenable. He made a quiet remark to Arthur Dean that Levi could not quite hear. Arthur Dean cleared his throat with the elaborate dignity of a man, rearranging his pride into something he could carry. "The council will agree to commission a formal investigation into the water supply," he announced, "with results to be reported within the fortnight." It was not everything Florence had asked for. It was not a full admission, and it was not an apology, and Gerald Whitmore looked far too comfortable with the arrangement for it to be entirely satisfying. But it was movement, and in Florence's experience, movement was how things began to change. She looked across the small crowd at the stranger who had spoken up. He was looking back at her, and there was nothing complicated in his expression, no particular triumph, no expectation of gratitude, just a kind of calm directness, as if saying what he had said had been simply the natural thing to do, which to him it had been. Florence Winslow was not in the habit of being speechless, but for a moment she was. She recovered quickly. She thanked the assembled crowd, asked Tom Beauchamp and 2 other ranchers to serve as witnesses to the council's promise, and then walked down off the town hall steps with her sign tucked under her arm and made her way through the dispersing crowd toward the stranger. "Mr. Lockhart," she said. He turned to her, and up close he was somewhat more weathered and somewhat more interesting than she had registered from a distance, with lines around his eyes that suggested he spent a lot of time squinting at horizons, and a quality of stillness that she associated with men who had learned to conserve their energy for the things that actually required it. "Miss Winslow," he said, "I hope I didn't overstep." "You did the opposite," she said. "You stepped in exactly when it mattered. Thank you." "It was nothing that needed thanking," he said. "You had it right. Someone just needed to say so." "In my experience," Florence said, and there was something in her voice that was dry and honest and only slightly bitter, "that has not always been enough." "No," he said, "I don't imagine it has." There was a moment that was not quite awkward and not quite comfortable, the particular moment that occurs when 2 people are recognizing something about each other that neither has words for yet. "Are you staying in Dusty Creek?" Florence asked. "Or is the blacksmith a temporary stop?" "The blacksmith was supposed to be temporary," Levi said. He looked down the main street, then back at her. "I am beginning to think I might stay a few days." Florence looked at him steadily. "There is a boarding house 2 streets over run by a woman named Harriet Doyle. She is a fair cook and she does not charge too much. And if the council's investigation turns into what I suspect it will turn into, we may need more witnesses." It was a practical offer, delivered in a practical way, and yet it was also an invitation, and they both knew it was both things at once. Levi put his hat back on. "I will find Mrs. Doyle," he said. "And Miss Winslow, good luck with your water." "Good luck implies it might go either way," she said. "I prefer to think of it as a matter of evidence. Evidence generally wins eventually." He smiled then, and it changed his face considerably, opening it up the way a window changes a room. "Generally," he agreed. Florence walked back toward the schoolhouse, because she had a classroom of children expecting her after the midday break, and Levi watched her go for exactly 2 seconds longer than was strictly necessary before turning toward Harriet Doyle's boarding house. Harriet Doyle was a widow of 62 who had run the boarding house for 11 years and had strong opinions about everything from the proper temperature at which to serve coffee to the current state of national politics. She took Levi in with the assessment of someone who had considerable practice reading strangers and announced that he was welcome as long as he wiped his boots, did not bring horses upstairs, and was at breakfast before it got cold. Levi agreed to all 3 conditions, paid for a week, and put his gear in a small, clean room with a window that looked out over the back garden, where Harriet was growing tomatoes with evident personal investment. That evening, he went to the Copper Spur, not from any particular desire for whiskey, but because saloons in frontier towns were where information gathered and pooled, and he was curious about the fuller picture of Dusty Creek's politics. He found what he expected, a room divided between the men who worked for themselves and the men who worked adjacent to Whitmore's money, and a good deal of careful silence on the subject of the morning's events. He had one drink and listened more than he talked, and what he heard confirmed what he had suspected. Gerald Whitmore's tanning operation was profitable and recent, and the town's older residents remembered when the creek ran clear, and a number of people who would not say so publicly were quietly furious about what had been happening. He also heard that Florence Winslow was considered by some to be a troublemaker of a different kind from the morning's official designation, a woman who asked too many questions, read too many books, and did not seem to understand that her role in the community had limits. He heard this from a man who had the particular tone of someone who found smart women personally threatening, and Levi found himself with a low and steady anger somewhere behind his sternum that he kept carefully out of his face. He walked back to the boarding house in the warm spring dark, under a sky so full of stars that the Milky Way was a visible stripe above the plains, and thought about Florence Winslow and her samples in jars and her sign on the town hall door, and the way she had stood in front of that crowd with the absolute certainty of someone who knows they are right even when everything around them is telling them they are wrong. He slept well. He had not slept particularly well in some months. The next morning, Florence arrived at the schoolhouse at 7:30, as she always did, to prepare the day's lessons before her students came in at 8. She was writing arithmetic problems on the chalkboard when she heard boots on the wooden step and turned to find Levi Lockhart standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee from the diner next door, looking slightly uncertain about whether he was welcome. "I spoke to Harriet Doyle this morning," he said. "She told me roughly where the school was." I thought he paused. He was a man who generally said what he meant and was finding the current situation slightly harder to navigate than he had expected. "I thought you might be able to use someone to talk through the investigation with. I know something about water sources and drainage from ranch work. I might be useful." Florence looked at him for a moment with those gray eyes that seemed to be reading several pages at once. Then she set down her chalk and accepted one of the coffees. "Do you know anything about the chemistry of tanning runoff?" she asked. "Not specifically," he said, "but I can learn what I need to." "Then sit down," she said. "We have 40 minutes before my students arrive, and I will show you what I found." She spread her notes on her desk, and there were many of them, organized and cross-referenced and annotated in a handwriting that was precise and slightly impatient-looking, and she walked him through everything she had documented: the timing of the discoloration, the pattern of illness, the comparison of water from the northern well versus the southern well, which was farther from the creek and showed no problems, the chemistry observations she had been able to make with the materials available to her. Levi asked good questions, not the questions of someone performing interest, but the questions of someone who was actually thinking, connecting what she was telling him to things he knew about how water moved through land. He asked about the gradient of the creek, about whether there were other operations upstream, about the soil composition in the area between Whitmore's tannery and the well. By the time the first students began appearing at the schoolhouse door, they had identified 2 additional lines of inquiry that Florence had not thought of, and Florence had the experience, which was rarer than it should have been, of having her mind genuinely engaged by another person's. She taught her class. Levi sat on the steps outside and read one of the books she had lent him, a pamphlet on water quality from an Eastern scientific journal that her father had kept, and when the noon recess came, they talked again. It became a pattern over the following 3 days. He was there in the morning with coffee. They talked. He spent his afternoons differently, riding out to look at the land between the tannery and the wells, speaking with ranchers whose property bordered the creek, gathering the kind of practical land knowledge that complemented Florence's scientific approach. In the evenings, they compared notes at the boarding house dining table, under Harriet Doyle's watchful and amused supervision. It was on the 4th day that Levi rode out to the Whitmore tannery itself. He had no official standing to do so, and he was aware of that. But he was also a man who had spent years working on land, and he knew how to look at a piece of country with an informed eye. He told the man at the tannery gate that he was thinking of setting up a similar operation in the area and was interested in seeing how it was run. The man at the gate was not particularly suspicious. Levi looked like what he said he was, a working man with a practical interest. What he saw was what he expected to see. The waste from the tanning process, the lye water and animal matter and various chemical runoff, was being channeled into a rudimentary drainage ditch that ran directly toward the creek. There was no settling pond, no treatment, nothing that would be considered adequate by the standards of the major tanneries in the East. Whitmore had saved considerable money by doing it this way, and that money had come at the direct expense of Dusty Creek's water supply. Levi took careful note of everything and rode back to town. He found Florence in her schoolroom after the children had gone home, grading papers with a concentrated frown, and he sat down across from her and told her exactly what he had seen. Florence set down her pen. She looked at him with an expression that was satisfied and sad in equal measure, the expression of someone whose worst suspicion has been confirmed and who takes no pleasure in the confirmation. "This is enough," she said. "Between my samples and your direct observation, this is enough for a formal report. We need to get this to Fort Worth, to the state authorities, not to Dean and his counsel." "I agree," Levi said, "but that will take time. The nearest telegraph is in Abilene." "I can write the letter today," Florence said, "if someone can carry it tomorrow." "I can ride to Abilene," Levi said simply. She looked at him. "That is 2 days there and back." "My horse is rested," he said. "And I have nowhere else to be." Florence was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet there was something shifting between them that had been shifting gradually for 4 days and was now becoming too evident to be entirely ignored. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. It was an honest question, without accusation, asked with the directness of someone who preferred to understand things clearly. Levi considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Partly because it is the right thing to do," he said. "And partly because I have not felt useful in quite some time, and this feels useful." He paused again. "And partly because you are the most interesting person I have met in a considerable while, and riding to Abilene seems like a reasonable excuse to come back." Florence Winslow had not blushed in approximately 7 years, and she was irritated to find herself doing so now. She looked down at her papers with more focus than the arithmetic homework of 11-year-olds strictly required, and then she looked up at him again, and there was something in her eyes that was warmer than her usual composed expression. "That is a very long way to ride for an excuse," she said. "Some things are worth the distance," he said. She wrote the letter that evening, 4 pages in her precise handwriting, addressed to the Texas State Board of Health in Austin, copied to the Federal Land Office, and additionally to a scientific colleague of her father's who worked at the University of Texas. She included all her documentation and Levi's observational account, which she had him dictate to her, and which she wrote in her own hand to make it more formal, and she sealed it all with the particular care of someone who understands that a letter may be the most powerful thing she owns. Levi left at dawn with the letter in his saddlebag and enough provisions for the road, and Florence stood at the edge of town in the early light and watched him go with a feeling she did not immediately name, because she was not quite ready to name it. He was back on the third morning, riding in before breakfast had been cleared from Harriet's table, covered in dust and tired, but with the satisfied look of a man who has done what he set out to do. He had sent the telegraph from Abilene. He had also, at some expense to himself, spoken to a law office there about the legal standing of the situation, and returned with the information that a state inspector could be compelled to visit if enough documented evidence was presented, and that Gerald Whitmore's operation, if found to be contaminating a town water supply, was in violation of several existing statutes. Florence heard all of this over coffee and scrambled eggs at Harriet Doyle's table, and Harriet herself listened with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for things to move in the right direction and was gratified to see it happening. "Good," Florence said when Levi finished. "Now we wait." "Are you good at waiting?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Not particularly," he said, "but I am better at it when there is good company." Harriet Doyle made a small sound that was clearly a suppressed comment and refilled Levi's coffee without being asked. The waiting turned out to be 15 days. 15 days during which Florence taught her class and gathered additional statements from affected families, and kept a careful log of any new developments. And Levi found work with Tom Beauchamp's ranch, helping with the spring cattle work, which gave him something to do with his hands and his considerable practical skills, and also gave him deep roots in the community's goodwill. Tom Beauchamp was the kind of man whose opinion carried weight, and his obvious respect for Levi did not go unnoticed. During those 15 days, they also, quietly and without either of them making any great declaration about it, began to know each other properly. They walked together in the evenings after Florence finished her grading, along the edge of town where the scrubland began and the light went gold and then copper, and then finally the deep purple of prairie dusk. Levi talked about his years on the cattle ranges, the places he had been, the things he had seen, not as a man performing his history for an audience, but as a man who had not had anyone to genuinely talk to in quite some time, and found it unexpectedly easy with her. Florence talked about her father and his books and the years before Dusty Creek, the way grief worked on a person, and the way work could be both a comfort and an escape, and the complicated feeling of caring so much about a town that did not always seem to care for her. "Did you always plan to fight everything?" Levi asked one evening, not unkindly, as they walked along a trail that had been worn into the grass by generations of people heading from town to creek. "I did not plan to fight anything," Florence said. "I planned to teach children and read books and live a quiet life. The fighting seemed to find me." "What found you first?" She thought about it. "My mother's death," she said. "There was no doctor who would come in time. We were too small a community and too poor for it to be worth anyone's effort. I was 9 years old, and I remember thinking that someone should have done something different, and that if no one else was going to think about that, then I was going to have to think about it myself." She paused. "It has been a somewhat exhausting philosophy." "But you have not given it up," he said. "No," she said. "I have not." He looked at her sidelong, and in the failing light she could not quite read his expression, but there was something in it that was very far from judgment. "Good," he said quietly. The state inspector arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of May. His name was Franklin Royce, and he was a thin, precise man from Austin who wore a suit that was somewhat inadequate for the Texas heat, and who carried a leather case full of testing equipment and official forms. He had been sent in response to Florence's letter, and he arrived with the authority of the state government, which transformed the situation in Dusty Creek immediately and significantly. Gerald Whitmore, who had spent the previous 2 weeks telling anyone who would listen that the investigation would clear him entirely, went very pale when he saw Franklin Royce step down from the coach. The inspection took 2 days. Florence provided her documentation and guided Royce through her methodology, which he reviewed with evident respect. Levi showed him the drainage situation at the tannery, and Royce looked at it with the expression of a man who has seen this kind of thing before and is deeply tired of seeing it. He took samples from both wells and from the creek at multiple points. On the second afternoon, Royce sat down with the town council at a table in the hall and presented his findings with the efficiency of a man who had too many reports to write to waste time on dramatics. The northern well was contaminated. The contamination was consistent with tanning process runoff. The source was, beyond reasonable doubt, the Whitmore operation. The operation was in violation of state health statutes and would be required to either cease or implement proper waste management procedures within 60 days. Additionally, the northern well would need to be closed until the creek cleared, and alternative water arrangements would need to be made. Arthur Dean listened to all of this with the expression of a man watching an avalanche arrive from a distance, and understanding that there was nothing to be done about it. Gerald Whitmore made one attempt to dispute the findings, citing the cost of the required changes and the impact on his business. Franklin Royce looked at him with the particular flatness of a bureaucrat who has heard every version of this argument and is unmoved by all of them, and told him that the cost of compliance was significantly less than the penalties for continued violation, and suggested he find himself a lawyer. Whitmore left the meeting without looking at Florence, and Florence was glad of it, because she was not entirely sure she could have kept her expression appropriate if he had. Outside the hall afterward, Tom Beauchamp shook her hand. Mabel Greer hugged her. Several of the women who had stood with her on that first morning embraced her with a warmth that was very different from the formal handshake, and Florence, who had been holding herself tightly together through the entire inspection, felt something in her chest loosen in a way that was dangerously close to tears. She did not cry, but it was a near thing. Levi was standing at the edge of the group, and when the crowd thinned and she made her way toward him, he was watching her with an expression that she had learned in 2 weeks to associate with him at his most genuine, direct and warm and slightly careful, as if he was always aware that the words mattered. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said. "Without your observation of the tannery, we would not have had enough for the inspector to come. Without your 6 weeks of documentation, there would have been nothing for the inspector to work from," he said. "Do not diminish your own work, Miss Winslow." She smiled then, and it was the real smile, not the composed public one, but the one that appeared when her guard was down and she was genuinely pleased. "Florence," she said, "I think we are past Miss Winslow at this point." "Florence," he said, and something about the way he said it simply, with no particular emphasis, but as if it were the exact right word, made her breath do something she chose not to analyze. "I owe you dinner," she said. "I cannot cook particularly well, but the diner on Elm Street does a fine steak, and it is the least I can do." "I would like that," he said. They ate dinner at the Elm Street diner, which was warm and smelled of wood smoke and beef and baking bread, and they sat across a small table from each other and talked for 3 hours without either of them noticing the time passing. They talked about everything that was not the water situation, about books, about the nature of justice in a country that was still working out what it wanted to be, about what came after for both of them. Florence talked about whether she wanted to stay in Dusty Creek or whether the town's relationship with her could survive her recent behavior. Levi talked about what he was looking for, which he described in terms that were careful and not entirely complete, as if some part of the answer was still forming itself. "You said you have been trying to figure out what to do with the second half of your life," Florence said. "What have you figured out so far?" Levi considered his coffee. He looked up at her. "That I want it to be somewhere I can put down roots," he said. "That I am tired of moving for its own sake. That I would like to build something, though I am not entirely sure yet what that something is." "Land?" she asked. Possibly land, he said. Tom Beauchamp has mentioned that the property adjoining his eastern boundary is available. The soil is good and there is water access that is not the northern creek. He paused. I have some savings, not as much as I would like, but enough to start. Florence was quiet, processing this information and what it might mean. You would stay in Dusty Creek, she said. It was not quite a question. I am considering it, he said. He met her eyes. There seemed to be good reasons to. The conversation after that was not about land or reasons. It was about smaller things. A book she had been reading about frontier medicine. A story he told about a night on the Panhandle Range when the northern lights had appeared, which was a rare thing that far south, and they had all come out of their bedrolls to watch them in astonished silence. He described it so well that she could see it, the green and silver curtain across the immense dark sky, and she thought that he was someone who noticed beauty and held it carefully. They walked back from the diner in the warm spring night, past the town hall where the sign had been and now was not, along the main street where the lanterns in the windows were going out one by one as Dusty Creek settled into sleep. At the corner of the street that led to the boarding house, Levi stopped. "Florence," he said. She turned to him. The moonlight was strong enough to see by, and his face was very clear and very serious in it. "I do not want to get ahead of what is actually between us," he said. "I am aware that we have known each other less than a month and that I arrived as a complete stranger, and that you have a great many more important things to think about than a drifting cowboy who happened to say the right thing at a town council meeting." He paused. "But I think about you a great deal, more than I am accustomed to thinking about anyone, and I think you deserve to know that plainly." Florence Winslow looked at him for a long moment. She had been self-sufficient since she was 9 years old. She had learned to need very little from other people, because needing things from other people was a position of vulnerability, and vulnerability had not reliably served her. She had built her life around her own capacities and her own convictions, and she had been genuinely content with that mostly. There had been loneliness, sometimes, in the quiet hours, but she had learned to fill the quiet hours with work, and work had generally been enough. She was discovering that it had not been entirely enough after all, and that the particular kind of company she had found in the last weeks was a thing she had not known she was missing, because she had never had it before to know that it was missing. "I think about you too," she said, "more than I expected to." He looked at her with that expression that was careful and warm all at once, and then he reached out and took her hand very gently, as if asking a question, and she let him hold it. They stood there for a moment in the moonlit street, and it was not dramatic in any external sense. There was no grand gesture, no sweeping action, but it was the most significant moment Florence had experienced in a very long time, and she knew it. "Good night, Florence," he said. "Good night, Levi," she said. She walked home with her hand warm where his had been, and her heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar, and not entirely unwelcome. The following weeks brought a different kind of energy to Dusty Creek. The northern well was closed, and the town arranged water delivery from the southern well and 2 private wells, whose owners generously allowed shared access. Whitmore, faced with the inspector's findings, and the loss of any community goodwill he had once possessed, began the required modifications to his drainage system, hiring a proper engineer from Fort Worth to oversee the construction of a settling pond and filtration system. He did this without grace or acknowledgement, but he did it, and that was what mattered. Arthur Dean, who had a politician's instinct for survival, made a small, carefully worded public statement that expressed the council's appreciation for the diligent attention of community members to the water situation, which was about as close to an apology as a man like him was likely to produce. He did not formally rescind the Troublemaker label, but he also did not repeat it, and in Dusty Creek's social ecosystem, that was considered a form of retreat. Florence received a letter from the scientific colleague of her father's at the University of Texas, expressing interest in her methodology and asking whether she might correspond further with the university's chemistry department. She wrote back the same afternoon with 4 pages of barely contained excitement. And Levi Lockhart spoke to the man who owned the land adjacent to Tom Beauchamp's eastern boundary and began the process of purchasing it. He told Florence about the land purchase on a Sunday afternoon in late May, when they were sitting on the wide, low fence at the edge of Tom Beauchamp's property, where the grassland ran open and golden to the distant hills. They had taken to spending Sunday afternoons together when Florence's school week was done and Levi's ranch work paused for the Sabbath, and these afternoons had become the part of the week that both of them looked forward to most, though neither had said so precisely. "I have made an offer," he said, "and it has been accepted. The land will be mine at the end of June." Florence looked at the horizon for a moment. "How much land?" she asked. 400 acres, he said. "Some of it is already fenced. The old homestead building is not much, but the bones are sound. It needs work." "You are going to build a ranch," she said. "A cattle operation," he said. "Smaller scale than what I managed before. I do not have the capital for a large herd yet, but I know cattle and I know the work, and I know the land in this area now well enough to be confident in the water access." He paused. "It is the kind of thing a man does when he has decided to stop moving." Florence turned to look at him. He was watching her with that careful, direct quality that she had come to associate with his most honest moments. "Are you certain?" she asked. "4 months ago, you had no particular reason to be in Dusty Creek." "4 months ago, I had no particular reason to be anywhere," he said. "It is remarkable what a good reason does for a man's sense of direction." She looked at him steadily. "Levi," she said, "are you talking about the land or about me?" "Both," he said honestly, "but primarily you." There was a long, quiet moment, warm with the late May sun, and the sound of the wind moving through the grass and a meadowlark doing its business on a fence post 30 yards away. And in that moment, Florence Winslow made a decision that she had been approaching gradually, with the caution of someone who had been burned by too many fires in her life, and which she was now ready to arrive at. "Then, I am glad you have found a reason," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he smiled, that full, open smile that changed his face, and he reached out and covered her hand with his on the top of the fence rail, and she turned her hand over to hold his properly. "I would like to court you," he said, "formally, with the full understanding that I am asking something significant of a woman who has considerable claims on her own time and energy and independence." Florence laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that surprised her by coming out of her, full and genuine. "You have been courting me," she said, "somewhat informally perhaps, but effectively." "Then allow me to make it official," he said. "Permitted," she said. "And Levi, I should tell you clearly that I am not a woman who is going to become someone else because she is being courted. I will still sign petitions and write letters and make trouble for town councils when the situation calls for it." "I know that," he said. "It is one of the things I find most admirable about you." She looked at him. "That is a rare thing for a man to say and mean." "I mean it," he said simply. She believed him. And that belief was itself a significant and unusual thing. The summer of 1878 moved at the particular pace of a Texas summer, slowly in the heat of the middle days and quickly in the long, productive evenings. Florence taught summer lessons for the children whose parents wanted to keep up their education through the break season, which was a smaller group but a dedicated one. And she continued her correspondence with the university and began writing a formal account of the Dusty Creek water situation for a scientific journal that her father's colleague had recommended. Levi took possession of his land on the 1st of July and moved from Harriet Doyle's boarding house to the old homestead on his new property, which was a modest 2-room structure that had seen better decades, but which proved to have sound walls and a good roof once he inspected it properly. He spent the summer working it simultaneously with his contributions to Tom Beauchamp's operation, and he was often visible in the early mornings and late evenings in the town itself, because the land was only 2 miles out and he had reasons to come to town, mostly her. They were together most evenings by midsummer. Sometimes they walked, Sometimes they sat on Harriet Doyle's porch with cups of coffee and Harriet's slightly theatrical pretense of not listening. Sometimes they sat in the schoolroom after hours, and he helped her grade papers or listened to her read passages from whatever she was working on. He was a good listener, which Florence had found to be rare. He did not listen to be polite or to wait for his turn to speak. He listened because he was genuinely interested, and she could feel the difference. He kissed her for the first time on a July evening, standing at the edge of the schoolyard where the big cottonwood tree made a kind of shelter from the last angle of the sun, and it was a gentle and deliberate thing, asked before it happened, the way all important things should be asked. Florence had half expected to feel the particular self-consciousness that came with new intimacy, but what she felt instead was something much simpler, that this was right, and that right things had a recognizable quality if you paid attention. She kissed him back with the quiet certainty of a woman who has made up her mind, and the cottonwood rustled in the summer evening air, and the meadowlarks called in the long grass beyond the fence, and it was very ordinary and very perfect. By August, most of Dusty Creek had formed an opinion about Florence Winslow and Levi Lockhart, and for once the opinion was predominantly warm. The water situation had shifted sentiment. The closed northern well was a physical reminder daily of what Florence had fought for, and the fact that the Beale children and several others had recovered their health since the well was closed was not lost on anyone. Tom Beauchamp spoke well of Levi to everyone he encountered, and the combination of Florence's established reputation as a teacher and Levi's growing one as a solid and hardworking man was proving to be a foundation that the community was willing to stand on. Arthur Dean remained carefully neutral, which in its own way was a form of endorsement. Gerald Whitmore sold a portion of his operation in September, citing the cost of compliance, and spent considerably less time at the town council table thereafter. Florence was not naive enough to think that everything was resolved. She was a woman in the American West in 1878, and the world was what it was. She would continue to face walls built from assumption and tradition, and she knew it. But she had won something real, and she had gained something real, and the combination of those two things made the walls feel less permanent than they had before. In September, Levi bought 12 cattle from a ranch near Abilene and brought them to his land, which marked the official beginning of his operation. He named the ranch the Calico Creek Operation, partly for his horse and partly for the creek that ran along the eastern edge of his property, which was a different creek from the one in town, and ran clear and clean over pale stone. Florence helped him paint the name board for the gate, which was a cooperative exercise that resulted in considerable paint on both of them and a great deal of laughter, and she hung it herself because Levi was holding the post and someone had to. That autumn was beautiful in the way that Texas autumns can be, the heat broken at last by cooler air coming down from the north, the sky a pure and endless blue, the grassland going gold and red in the lower areas. Florence finished her account of the Dusty Creek situation and sent it to the Journal, and received 2 weeks later a letter informing her that it would be published in the spring edition, along with her name and credentials. She read that letter several times in the privacy of her schoolroom before she allowed herself to feel what she felt about it, which was a profound and complicated satisfaction. She told Levi that evening at the ranch, sitting on the porch he had built to replace the original collapsed one, watching the last of the sunset do extraordinary things over the western hills. "They are going to publish it," she said. He turned from the view to look at her, and the expression on his face was the kind that required no words but had some anyway. "Florence," he said, "that is wonderful." He reached out and took her hand. "Your father would have been proud." She had not expected that particular phrasing, and it caught her somewhere deep. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "he would have." They sat with that for a while, the grief and the pride existing together in the kind of comfortable complexity that people who have built real trust between them can hold without needing to resolve it. The proposal came on a November evening when the first real cold of the season was in the air, and the ranch house was warm with the wood stove and the smell of coffee and wood smoke. They had spent the afternoon going through the books for the small ranch operation, which Florence had an unexpected talent for organizing, and the evening had turned into one of those entirely comfortable hours that had become the norm for them, close and easy, and full of the particular warmth of two people who have learned each other's rhythms. Levi put down his coffee mug and turned to her, and something in the quality of his attention shifted into the particular register that Florence had learned to associate with things he was about to say that mattered. "I want to ask you something," he said. She set down her pen and looked at him. "Then ask it." He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man choosing his words with care, not from uncertainty about the question, but from a desire to ask it properly. "I have known you for 6 months," he said. "In 6 months I have watched you stand up in front of a town council and refuse to back down. I have watched you teach children with the kind of patience and commitment that most people do not apply to anything. I have read your work and known it to be good. I have talked with you about everything I have thought worth talking about in my life, and every single day I have been more certain about you than I was the day before." He paused. "I am not a man with a great deal to offer in terms of material wealth right now. I have a small herd and 400 acres and a ranch house that I am still in the process of making livable. But I will work hard every day of my life, and I mean every word I have ever said to you, and I think the two of us together would be something worth building." He looked at her steadily with all of himself in it. "Florence Winslow, will you marry me?" Florence Winslow sat with that question for exactly the amount of time it took her to understand that she had already known the answer for some time and had simply been waiting for the asking. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Levi Lockhart, with the explicit understanding that I will keep teaching my students and writing my letters and arguing with people when the situation requires it. I would not have it any other way," he said, and he meant it completely. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple silver band with a small turquoise stone, which was not what a jeweler's catalog would have offered but which was precisely right, and she said so when he put it on her finger, and she held her hand up in the lamplight and looked at the way the turquoise caught the warm light. They were married on the 15th of December, 1878, in the Dusty Creek church that was getting new paint on its southern face. The ceremony was performed by the town minister, a gentle man named Pastor Cole, and attended by everyone in Dusty Creek who was positively disposed toward either of them, which turned out to be most of the town. Harriet Doyle wept openly and made no apologies for it. Tom Beauchamp stood as witness. Mabel Greer organized the reception at the church hall afterward with the efficiency of a military general and the warmth of a grandmother. Florence wore her mother's brooch pinned to a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the preceding 2 months, and she walked up the aisle of that church with no one to give her away because she had never been anyone's to give, and she was her own woman walking toward a choice she had made with her whole self. Levi was standing at the front of the church in the cleanest suit he owned, which he had pressed himself, and when she came through the door and he saw her, his face did the thing that it did when he felt something deeply went very still and then very open. And that expression, more than any other part of the ceremony, was the thing she would remember most vividly for the rest of her life. Pastor Cole's words were simple and serious and true, and Levi's voice when he made his vows was steady and quiet and absolute, and Florence's voice was not trembling despite the fact that she had been certain it would, because she was more certain than she had ever been about anything, and certainty is its own steadiness. After the reception, after the cake that Harriet Doyle had made, after the fiddle music and the dancing and the long warm evening that spilled out of the church hall into the cold December night, They drove back to the ranch in the wagon Levi had borrowed from Tom Beauchamp, bundled in wool blankets against the cold, and the stars over the Texas plains were extraordinary, the Milky Way arching clear from horizon to horizon. Florence leaned against Levi's shoulder and looked up at them. "Do you remember the northern lights you described?" she said. "On the Panhandle." "I remember," he said. "I think I should like to see them someday," she said. "Then someday we will go north in the right season," he said, "and you will see them." She tucked closer against him, and he put his arm around her, and Calico pulled the wagon home through the brilliant cold night. The ranch became something over the years that followed. Slowly, as good things build slowly, not all at once but in stages, each improvement making the next possible, each season's work adding to the season before it. By the spring of 1879, Levi had doubled his herd with careful choices and good range management, and the cattle operation that had begun with 12 animals was becoming something that could sustain a family comfortably. Florence continued teaching. The Dusty Creek School Board, under pressure from an increasingly educated and vocal parent community, approved her request for a second teacher in the autumn of 1879, which meant Florence could teach the older children with more concentration and spend time developing curriculum in areas she had not been able to address with a single-teacher classroom. She also continued her correspondence with the university, which had led by 1879 to an invitation to contribute a second article and an acknowledgement that the Dusty Creek water case was being cited in discussions about rural public health across the state. Arthur Dean did not become a different man, but he did become a more careful one, and the town council began, with glacial slowness, to actually consider the input of its community members rather than simply performing consideration of it. This was a small change and a significant one, and Florence was under no illusion that she had created it alone, but she was aware that she had contributed to the conditions that made it possible. Gerald Whitmore's tannery continued to operate with its modified drainage system, which met state requirements and produced no further water quality issues. Whitmore himself eventually relocated his primary residence to Fort Worth, which suited Dusty Creek adequately. In June of 1879, Florence discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Levi on a Tuesday morning in the ranch kitchen, over the coffee she had made, with the simplicity of someone reporting an important and wonderful fact. Levi set down his cup and looked at her with such complete and undisguised joy that she felt it in her own chest like a second heartbeat. "Florence," he said. "I know," she said. He came around the table and took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that was characteristic of him at his most genuine, and he kissed her forehead and then her lips and then her forehead again, and she laughed and put her arms around him, and they stood in the morning kitchen with the sunlight coming through the east-facing window and the smell of coffee in the warm air, holding on to each other. Their son was born in February of 1880. They named him Thomas Edmund Lockhart, Thomas for Tom Beauchamp, who had been their most steadfast friend through everything, and Edmund for Florence's father. He arrived after a difficult labor that lasted long enough to test everyone's patience, with the midwife, a steady and capable woman named Ruth Alvarez, in attendance, and Levi in the outer room pacing a groove in his own floor. When Ruth brought him the boy, wrapped in flannel, and told him that Florence was rested and well, Levi Lockhart sat down in his own kitchen chair and held his son and said nothing at all for a full minute, which was the most expressive silence Florence had ever heard described to her afterward. Thomas Edmund was a vigorous and loud baby who grew into a vigorous and curious toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and his own entirely individual personality that announced itself clearly by the time he was walking. He was interested in everything. He needed to touch and examine and understand every object he encountered. Florence recognized this as something she understood deeply, and she began reading to him almost before he had words, and by the time he was 3, he had opinions about stories. Levi was exactly the father Florence had believed he would be: present and patient, and genuinely interested in his son's interior life, not merely in the practical business of raising a child. He taught Thomas to ride at an age when most children were still negotiating stairs with attention, and Thomas took to horses with an ease that was clearly inherited, but also authentically his own. He sat on Calico, who was aging gracefully, with a seriousness that made Levi and Florence look at each other over the child's head with identical expressions of suppressed delight. The article Florence had written about the Dusty Creek water situation was cited in a state legislative discussion about rural water quality standards in 1881, and she received an official letter from the Texas state government acknowledging her contribution. She framed it and put it in the schoolroom, not in her own home, because she thought the children should see it, should see that a woman could do this, could gather evidence and write clearly and make a thing happen in the world. The summer of 1882 was particularly fine. The ranch was producing well. Levi had hired 2 hands, brothers named Pete and James Corrigan, who were good workers and easy company, and the herd had grown to a size that was producing real income. Florence had been offered, and had accepted, the position of head teacher for Dusty Creek School, which came with a modest increase in wages and the official acknowledgement of what had been functionally true for 4 years. It was that summer that she discovered she was expecting again. Levi received this news in almost exactly the way he had received it the first time, which Florence found deeply reassuring. Some men loved the idea of a first child and were less enthusiastic about subsequent ones. Levi Lockhart was evidently not such a man. Their daughter was born in the winter of 1882, a December child like the month of their wedding. They named her Clara Ruth Clara for the simple pleasure of the name, Ruth for the midwife who had attended both births and who was a woman of considerable skill and dignity. Clara was smaller than Thomas had been and considerably quieter in those first weeks, and she had Florence's dark hair and Levi's eyes, which turned out to be a very striking combination on a small face. Thomas, who was 2.5, regarded his sister with the serious, evaluative expression of a person conducting an important assessment, and then announced that she was acceptable, which was considered high praise from a 2-year-old. The years after that were the years of building, in all the senses of the word. The ranch house, which had started as 2 sound rooms and a lot of promise, gained a proper porch across the entire south face, a second bedroom, a proper kitchen addition, and eventually a small study room that was nominally shared but was primarily Florence's, where her books lived and where she wrote her letters and her articles, and, increasingly, the lesson plans and curriculum guides that she was developing, and which other frontier schools were beginning to request copies of. Levi's cattle operation grew to a comfortable mid-sized ranch by frontier standards, not the grandest outfit in the region but solid and profitable and respected, and the name Calico Creek was known in the cattle markets at Abilene and beyond as a mark of quality animal husbandry. His reputation in the community had long since settled into the kind of deep, unpretentious respect that comes from years of honest dealing and solid work. Thomas turned 5 and began school under his mother's teaching, which presented both of them with the complicated experience of a professional relationship overlaid on a family one, and which they navigated with the practicality of 2 people who understood that some things are simply complicated, and that this does not mean they cannot be done. Harriet Doyle, who had become as close to a grandmother as either Florence or Levi had left in the world, celebrated her 70th birthday in 1883 with a dinner at the ranch that she declared was the finest evening she had spent since the Johnson girls' wedding of 1869, which was, from Harriet, the highest possible praise. She was still running her boarding house, though she had taken on a young woman named Ada to help with the heavier work, and she still had strong opinions about everything. The town of Dusty Creek grew through the decade, as Texas grew, as the frontier moved and settled and transformed. New families arrived. New businesses established themselves. A proper doctor set up his practice in 1884, which was something Florence had worked toward for years, writing letters to the county medical board and organizing a community petition, and doing all the things that she did, persistently and methodically, until the thing happened. The doctor, a young man named Philip Marsh, arrived to find that the schoolteacher had prepared the ground so thoroughly that his practice was supported from the first week. He also arrived to find that the water situation was entirely resolved, the Whitmore Tannery's drainage system having been functioning adequately for 6 years, and that the town had a functioning relationship with the state health board that was the direct legacy of Florence's 1878 campaign. He told her so, with genuine admiration, at the first community gathering after his arrival. Florence received this admirably, but directed him immediately to the question of whether there were any health concerns he had noticed in his first week that required attention, because she was, above all things, practical. Levi, watching this from across the room with a glass of lemonade, smiled to himself in a way that required no translation. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, December of 1888, Levi and Florence sat together on the ranch porch in the cold night air, bundled in wool, with the ranch house warm and lit behind them and the sound of Thomas, who was 8 now, playing some elaborate game in the parlor involving a great many imaginary participants, and Clara, who was 5, already asleep, and having firmly believed up to the moment of sleep that she was not at all tired. 10 years, Florence said. 10 years, Levi said. She looked at him in the clear winter dark. He was 41 now, and the years of outdoor work had continued to write themselves on his face in the way she had always found interesting rather than anything else. There was more gray in his dark hair than there had been, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, and he looked exactly like himself, like the man who had ridden into Dusty Creek on a bay horse and raised his hand at a council meeting and said what needed saying. "Do you remember the day we met?" she asked. "I remember every part of it," he said. "I remember you at that door with your sign, and I remember thinking that you were the most certain person I had ever seen." "I was terrified," she said. He turned to look at her. "Were you?" "Entirely," she said. "I had been terrified all morning. I was very good at not showing it by that point." He laughed, and it was the full, warm laugh that she loved, the one that came from all the way down. "I had no idea," he said. "Good," she said. "That was the goal." He put his arm around her, drawing her close against the cold, and she tucked into the familiar warmth of his shoulder, and they sat together looking out over the ranch land that was their shared work and their shared life, the grassland silver and still under the December stars. "I want to tell you something," Levi said. His voice had dropped into the register that meant it was real. "I tell you this kind of thing not often enough." "Tell me," she said. "When I rode into this town 10 years ago, I had nothing pointing in any particular direction," he said. "I was a man going nowhere slowly, and I had gotten used to it well enough that I had stopped noticing what I was missing." He paused. "I have thought about it many times since, about how close I came to riding straight through without stopping. If Calico had not thrown that shoe 3 miles back, I would never have been there for that council meeting, and I would never have known what I missed." He turned to look at her in the cold dark. "I'm so grateful for that thrown shoe that I think about it with something close to reverence." Florence lifted her head from his shoulder and looked up at him. In 10 years of marriage to this man, she had learned the contours of his heart as well as she had ever learned anything, and she loved what she found there, the steadiness and the honesty and the capacity for genuine tenderness that he carried without pretension. "I was afraid to trust it," she said. "You, I mean. Not because of you specifically, but because trusting things had not always served me well." "I know," he said, "but you made it easy," she said. "Not because you were easy, you are sometimes quite difficult, but because you were always yourself. exactly what you appeared to be, and that is rarer than it should be." He kissed her temple, and then the curve of her cheek, and then found her lips in the cold night air, and it was the kiss of two people who have been kissing each other for 10 years and have not grown tired of it, which is the best kind of kiss there is. From inside the house came the sound of Thomas's game reaching some kind of climactic resolution, followed by Clara's voice. She was not as asleep as they had believed, announcing an opinion about whatever her brother was doing. Levi and Florence pulled apart and looked at each other with the particular expression that parents of children share when the children have made themselves known at an interesting moment. "We should go in," Florence said. "We should," he agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. The stars were extraordinary over the ranch, the same stars that had been there that first winter night when they had driven home from their wedding, that Levi had once described from a panhandle range and a night of northern lights. Florence looked up at them for another moment. "The northern lights," she said suddenly. Levi looked at her. "What about them?" "You promised we would go north in the right season to see them," she said. "I did," he said. "We have not gone yet," she said. "We have not," he agreed. Florence turned to him with that expression that he knew, the one that meant a plan was forming. "Thomas is 8, she said. "Old enough for a real journey. Clara is 5. We could go north in the spring to Kansas, maybe Colorado, and have a proper family adventure. And if we time it right in the fall on the way back, perhaps we will see them." Levi looked at her and felt the particular warmth that was specific to her, to Florence, to this woman who had at 26 nailed a sign to a town hall door and refused to move and had made him want to stay for the first time in years, and who had not for a single day since stopped being exactly the person he had seen in that first moment. "Spring," he said. "I will start planning the route." "I will plan the provisions," she said. "Of course you will," he said, with all the love in the world. She laughed, and they went inside together, into the warmth and the light and the particular joyful chaos of their shared life, where Thomas immediately demanded arbitration on whatever dispute had developed, and Clara looked up from her supposedly completed sleep with an expression of complete innocence that fooled no one, and the wood stove ticked warmly in the corner, and the ranch outside settled into its winter quiet under the immense Texas sky. In the spring of 1889, they made good on the plan, because Florence Winslow Lockhart was not the kind of person who let plans remain plans. They loaded a proper wagon, the kind built for long travel, with enough provisions for 6 weeks on the road, and they headed north out of Dusty Creek on a clear April morning with Pete Corrigan left in charge of the ranch and Harriet Doyle made the official keeper of the school keys. And Thomas sitting in the wagon bed with a map, he had drawn himself of where they were going, and Clara on Florence's lap watching the world go by with enormous attentive eyes. They went north through central Texas, into the Indian Territory, and then north into Kansas, and the country opened and changed around them in the way that country does when you are moving through it at the pace of a horse, slowly enough to see everything, fast enough that each day's landscape was genuinely new. Thomas asked questions about everything. Clara became an expert at spotting wildlife and announcing it. Levi drove with the ease of a man who knew how to read land, and Florence, beside him on the wagon seat, read to the children and told them things about the places they were passing through, the history, the geology, the way the people who had lived there before any of them had understood the land, and the complicated and often unjust way that understanding had been taken from those people and replaced with the current order of things. She spoke about it directly and honestly, as she spoke about most things, because she believed that the world her children grew up to inhabit would be slightly better if they understood it clearly rather than prettily. Levi listened too, and occasionally contributed observations of his own, and the conversations that happened in that wagon over 6 weeks were some of the most interesting and honest conversations any of them would have for a long time. They turned back south in August, and the following night, somewhere in the Kansas plains, they made camp on a rise that gave a clear view of the northern horizon, and at about 10 o'clock in the evening, Clara, who was supposed to be asleep, said from her bedroll, "What are those?" And they were the northern lights. Pale green curtains of them, rippling slow and silent across the northern sky, reflecting in the dark surface of a nearby creek, filling the horizon with cold fire. Thomas sat up from his bedroll with his mouth open. Clara pressed herself against Florence's side and looked up at the sky with an expression of complete wonder. Levi sat beside Florence with his arm around her, and she remembered what he had described years ago over a dinner table in a diner in Dusty Creek, all of them coming out of their bedrolls to watch in astonished silence, and she understood now exactly what that astonishment had felt like. "Oh," said Clara, very softly. "Yes," said Florence. They watched for an hour. Neither child slept, nobody minded. Driving home through Texas in September, with two children who had been on a 6-week adventure and were full of it in every sense, Florence looked at Levi in the afternoon light and thought about everything that had led to this moment: the sign on the town hall door, the morning with the coffee cups, the walk by the creek, the proposal in the ranch kitchen, the years of work and argument and growing and building. And she felt something so complete that she did not try to name it, only sat with it and was grateful. They arrived back in Dusty Creek on a Wednesday afternoon, dusty and tired and deeply content. Pete Corrigan had kept the ranch running without incident. Ada was managing the boarding house adequately in Harriet's judgment, which was the only judgment that mattered. The school was ready for the autumn term. Everything was as they had left it, and also subtly changed in the way that places are changed when you have been away and come back and see them fresh. Thomas went directly to the stable to check on the horses. Clara went to find Harriet Doyle, with whom she had a particular alliance based on shared opinions about certain kinds of baked goods. Levi unhitched the wagon with the ease of a man who had done it thousands of times, and Florence stood for a moment in the autumn late afternoon light and looked at the ranch, the house with its full south porch, the new room additions, the kitchen garden that was still producing late tomatoes, the fence that Levi had rebuilt section by section until it was properly right, the name board that she had helped paint 10 years ago now weathered and solid at the gate. She heard him behind her and turned. He had come to stand beside her, looking at the same view, and his expression was the one that she had first seen from across a town square crowd, the calm, direct, warm expression of a man who is simply being what he is, without performance or pretension. "Home," he said. "Home," she said. She took his hand, and they stood together looking at what they had built, and then they walked toward the house where their children were already in various rooms making various sounds that indicated life in full progress, and the autumn sun was warm on the south face of the building, and the grassland ran golden to the familiar line of hills, and the sky over Texas went on forever in every direction, wide and blue and endlessly, beautifully open. Thomas came running from the stable to tell them that the mare had a new foal while they were away, a fine roan colt, and that Pete had named him temporarily, but that Thomas had a different name in mind. Clara, appearing at the porch door with a piece of Harriet's cake in each hand, and one of them clearly intended as a delivery, announced that Harriet had said they were just in time for the September apple cake, and that no one should be late. Levi and Florence looked at each other in the gold autumn light, and somewhere in that look was everything they had built and been and chosen, every difficult morning and every beautiful evening, every argument and every moment of absolute certainty, the sign on the town hall door and the hand raised at the back of a crowd and the long road to this ordinary, extraordinary afternoon. "Apple cake," Florence said. "We should not be late," Levi agreed. They went inside together, into the warmth and the noise and the love, and the door closed behind them on the still and golden afternoon, and outside, the roan colt was learning its legs in the sunlit paddock, and the creek ran clear, and the name board hung on the gate at the entrance to Calico Creek Ranch, steady in a light September wind. And in Dusty Creek, on the wall of the schoolroom where the children learned to read and count, and understand the world they were growing into. Florence's framed letter from the state of Texas still hung, a reminder that evidence matters, and that one person willing to stand in front of a door and refuse to be moved can change things, and that sometimes the most important thing a stranger can do is simply stand up and say that the person everyone is against is right. Which is how it had all begun, and which was, in all the ways that counted, how it continued.